She was 29 years old and had nothing left to her name but a wagon, a mule, and $4.60 when the Millhaven Trust Company foreclosed on the last acre of ground her late husband had ever owned, on account of a debt she had not known existed until a notice was nailed to her own front door. The bank's agent, a smooth, soft-spoken man named Reginald Poole, explained with practiced regret that her husband, Daniel Whitfield, had mortgaged a farm the previous winter to cover a bad season, and that with Daniel 8 months in his grave from a wagon accident on the Millhaven Road, the debt now belonged to her, and the land now belonged to the bank. What she had left, once the wagon was loaded and the door shut behind her for the last time, was $4.60, a trunk of her mother's quilts, and a growing certainty that the world intended to grind her down to nothing at all. So when old Silas Dunmore offered to sell her the collapsed barn on his back 40 for $2, simply to be rid of the liability before it fell on someone's head, she paid it without hesitation, though the structure had folded in on itself like a broken accordion and hadn't sheltered so much as a chicken in a decade. Everyone said she was throwing good money after bad. But sealed behind a wall inside that ruined barn, hidden so carefully that no one had ever thought to look for it, lay a secret that had waited 11 years to be found, one that would not only save her, but would return to an entire township something that had been quietly stolen from beneath their feet. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you've ever been told that what you have left isn't worth anything, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Clara and Whitfield, born Clara and Bishop, had grown up on a modest wheat farm outside of Millhaven, a small township in the rolling grasslands of eastern Kansas, in a house her grandfather had built the same year the railroad first cut through the county in 1871. Her father, Wendell Bishop, was not a man of many words, but he was a man of exacting principle, and he had built his entire life around a single, unshakable conviction that the land itself never lied, even when the men who bought and sold it did. Wendell had come to Kansas as a boy with his own father, part of the great wave of settlers who staked claims under the Homestead Act, and he had watched, over the course of his life, as some of those claims were honestly earned and others quietly stolen through forged signatures, manipulated surveys, and the simple, grinding leverage that men with money always seemed to hold over men without it. He taught Clara, from the time she was old enough to walk the property line beside him, how to read a plat map, how to recognize a survey marker, how to understand the invisible grid of ownership that determined who could plant where and who could not, and he impressed upon her, again and again, that a person's claim to a piece of ground was only as strong as the paper that proved it, and that paper, once lost or destroyed, could take a lifetime of honest labor down with it. Land doesn't care who loves it best, Clara, he used to say, resting his hand on a corner post as though greeting an old friend. It only cares what the deed says. Guard your deed the way you guard your own heartbeat. Her mother, Margaret Bishop, gave her a different kind of grounding, one built from thread and fabric rather than survey chains, teaching Clara to quilt in the long winter evenings when the fields lay dormant beneath frost, piecing together scraps that seemed, individually, to be worth almost nothing: a torn hem, a worn-out dress, a flour sack gone soft with washing into something whole and warm and lasting. Margaret had a particular gift for finding the hidden pattern inside what looked, at first glance, like scrap and waste, and she used to tell Clara, guiding her small hands over the needle, that the truest test of a quiltmaker's skill was not what she did with fine new cloth, but what she could make from the pieces everyone else had already thrown away. Clara absorbed both lessons so thoroughly that by the time she reached adulthood, they had become less like separate skills and more like a single way of seeing the world, and instinct for recognizing that value was often hidden inside things that appeared, on their surface, ruined or worthless, and a stubborn, patient willingness to look closer before passing final judgment on anything. She married Daniel Whitfield when she was 22, a hard-working young farmer with an easy laugh and a gift for coaxing wheat out of even a stubborn season, and together they built a modest life on 80 acres just north of the Bishop homestead, close enough that Clara could still walk to her parents' house within the hour. Their 7 years of marriage were not without hardship, drought one summer and a bonfire another, but they were years marked by genuine partnership, Daniel handling the heavy labor of planting and harvest while Clara kept the books, mended what could be mended, and quietly, methodically, built up a small store of savings against the inevitable lean seasons that every farming family in that stretch of Kansas came to expect. She never had cause, in those years, to doubt her husband's judgment or his honesty, and it was only after his death, When the debt notice arrived from the Millhaven Trust Company bearing his signature on a mortgage she had never seen or heard mentioned, that she began to feel the first cold stirrings of suspicion she could not yet name a sense, familiar from her father's old warnings, that something about the paper itself did not sit quite right. Daniel died on a gray October afternoon when his wagon overturned on the steep grade of the Millhaven Road, thrown from his seat and struck by the very load of grain he'd been hauling to town, and the suddenness of it left Clara with a grief so total that for weeks she could barely remember to eat. She had perhaps 2 months of mourning, tending the farm alone with the help of a hired hand and her own 2 capable hands, before Reginald Poole arrived from the trust company with his leather satchel and his gentle, regretful voice, informing her that Daniel had taken out a mortgage against the farm the previous winter, using the land itself as collateral for a loan of $300, and that with 6 months of missed payments now accrued, the bank intended to exercise its right of foreclosure. Clara asked to see the original mortgage document, and Poole produced it readily enough, a formal paper bearing Daniel's signature at the bottom in ink that looked, to Clara's practiced eye, very slightly different from the signature she had watched him write 1,000 times across grain receipts and letters to his mother. She said nothing of this suspicion aloud, not yet, understanding from her father's teachings that an accusation without proof was worth less than silence, but she carried the seed of it with her through every subsequent conversation with the bank, watching, listening, and waiting for something solid enough to stand on. The county's land office in the seat town of Ashworth confirmed what Poole had told her, the mortgage properly recorded and filed, and the lawyer Clara consulted, a tired, overworked man named Bertram Cole who handled most of the township's small disputes, told her plainly that contesting a properly filed document would require proving forgery, a costly and uncertain undertaking with no guarantee of success, particularly against an institution as established as the Millhaven Trust. Clara listened to this counsel with her hands folded very still in her lap, the way her mother had taught her to sit through hard news, absorbing it without flinching, though something in her chest had already begun to harden into a quiet, determined resolve that she did not yet know how to act upon. She had 30 days to vacate the property, a mercy of sorts compared to what some families receive, and she spent those 30 days doing what needed doing with the same patient thoroughness her parents had taught her, selling the livestock she couldn't take, packing what remained of her mother's quilts and her own small store of keepsakes into a single trunk, and settling what debt she could before the last of her savings dwindled to almost nothing at all. When the accounting was finally done, Clara counted the coins in her purse 3 times, the way her father had taught her to always verify a sum before trusting it, and each count returned the same unforgiving total, $4.60. She was 29 years old, widowed, childless, and standing at the edge of everything she had ever known with a wagon, a mule, and less money than most families spent on a single month of flour and coffee. Her parents had passed within a year of each other some time before, of causes ordinary enough that the whole township had mourned alongside her, and there was no family homestead left to return to, the Bishop land having been sold, at her father's own instruction before his death, to settle his final medical debts. She took a small room above the Millhaven Mercantile, run by a widow named Henrietta Poe who let the space cheap in exchange for help minding the store, and she paid for it week by week, watching her small remaining fortune shrink with the same grim clarity that had carried her through every hard reckoning of her life. It was during her second week in that narrow room above the Mercantile that she overheard old Silas Dunmore complaining to Henrietta about the collapsed barn out on his back 40, a structure that had stood empty and unused since a windstorm folded its roof inward some 10 years before, leaving it a hazard to any wandering livestock or curious child fool enough to venture inside. Dunmore, who had inherited the acreage from a cousin and had no use for a barn he'd have to tear down eventually anyway, said he'd sell the ruin and the small plot it sat on for $2 to anyone willing to take the liability off his hands, since he'd rather have the coin than the trouble. Clara, standing at the edge of that conversation with her father's old voice in her ears telling her that land never lies even when men do, and her mother's voice reminding her that the truest value often hides in what everyone else calls waste, found herself saying, before she'd fully weighed the decision, that she'd take it. Dunmore laughed, not unkindly, called her a peculiar sort of widow, but took her $2 readily enough and had the small transaction recorded at the county office within the week, likely relieved to be free of a structure that had cost him nothing but worry. She walked out to the barn the following morning, a good 3 miles from town along a dusty wagon track, carrying a hatchet, a crowbar, and enough food for a full day's labor, and she saw immediately why Dunmore had been so eager to be rid of it. The structure had folded almost entirely in on its western side. The great roof beams collapsed in a jumble of splintered wood, though the eastern wall and a portion of the loft still stood, stubborn and improbable, against the grassland's relentless wind. She spent that first day simply clearing debris, hauling broken timber into piles she could burn later, and it was in the late afternoon, working her way along the one intact wall to assess how much of the structure might still be salvageable, that she noticed something her father's training had taught her to notice in any built thing. A section of the interior wall, tucked into the corner beneath what remained of the loft, did not match its surroundings. The boards there were slightly newer than the weathered gray timber everywhere else, their grain less silver by sun and rain, and they had been fitted with a care that seemed, to Clara's practiced eye, entirely disproportionate to a barn wall no one had any reason to build carefully. She worked at the edge of that section with her crowbar until one board came loose, then another, and behind them she found not solid barn wall but a shallow cavity, no more than 2 feet deep, framed with the same careful joinery as the false wall itself, and inside that cavity, wrapped in oil canvas that had kept the years mostly at bay, a wooden document case and a rolled bundle of papers tied with wax cord. She did not open them there in the fading light, some old instinct telling her that whatever she'd found deserved a clear head and better light than collapsing barn at dusk could offer, and she carried the bundle carefully back to her narrow room above the mercantile, her heart beating with an urgency she had not felt since before Daniel's death. She spent that evening and the whole of the following morning working through what she'd found, and what emerged, piece by careful piece, was a story that reshaped everything Clara understood about the years since her father's death and the true nature of the debt that had cost the farm. The document case held a set of original survey records and land patents dating back to 1873, bearing the careful signature of a man named Josiah Renfield, who, as Clara pieced together from the accompanying letters, had served as the township's original surveyor and land registrar, the man responsible for establishing the boundary lines that every subsequent deed and mortgage in the county depended upon. The rolled papers, when Clara untied their wax cord, proved to be Renfield's personal notes, written in a small, careful hand across the final 2 years of his life, and they described, with mounting anxiety, a pattern of quiet fraud he had discovered within his own office. Certain survey corrections, submitted years after the original claims were filed, had shifted boundary lines by small but consequential margins, always in ways that benefited a single local land agent working in partnership with a newly established Millhaven Trust Company, a man whose name struck Clara with a jolt of recognition sharp enough to make her sit down hard on the edge of a narrow bed. Harlan Voss, the very man who now served as president of the Millhaven Trust and who had, Clara now recalled with a slow, cold understanding, personally approved the mortgage against her own farm. Renfield's notes explained that the fraudulent boundary corrections had allowed Voss and his partners to quietly claim strips of valuable land along the creek bottoms and rail spur, land that rightfully belonged, under the original 1873 surveys, to a dozen or more homesteading families across the township, families who had no reason to question corrected paperwork bearing an official surveyor's seal. Renfield, it seemed, had confronted Voss privately about the discrepancies, and had been met not with denial but with a chilling and specific threat against his family's safety, sufficient to convince him to keep silent rather than risk exposing what he knew, rather than destroy the evidence outright. Though Renfield had hidden it, along with the original uncorrected survey documents that would prove the fraud beyond question, inside the wall of his own barn, on land that had at that time still belonged to him, trusting that someday someone patient enough to look would find it. His final entry, dated only weeks before his own sudden death from what the county recorded as a fall from his horse, expressed his hope that whoever eventually discovered the hidden documents would have the courage to see justice done where he himself had lacked it. Clara sat with those documents for a long while, the same cold clarity settling over her that had carried her through every hard reckoning since Daniel's death, and she understood, with growing certainty, that she now held proof of fraud that had shaped the fortunes of Millhaven Township for over a decade, and that the very mortgage which had cost her Daniel's farm had likely been built, in some fashion she did not yet fully understand, on the same foundation of manipulated paper that had once cost a dozen honest families their rightful land. She did not act rashly. She spent the better part of a week cross-referencing Renfield's original survey figures against the current recorded boundaries at the Ashworth County office, working with the same painstaking care her father had taught her to bring to any question of land and paper, and what she found confirmed every fear the old surveyor's notes had raised. The boundary corrections Renfield had documented aligned precisely with land now held by the Millhaven Trust or by companies quietly connected to Harlan. Thus, land that included, Clara realized with a chill that ran the length of her spine, a strip along the creek bottom directly adjoining what had once been the Whitfield farm, land whose true ownership, under the original 1873 survey, would have made Daniel's mortgage collateral worth substantially more than the bank had ever acknowledged, a discrepancy that, Clara began to suspect, might explain far more about the circumstances of her husband's debt than she had yet allowed herself to consider. She began, cautiously, to ask questions around Millhaven, framing her curiosity as simple interest in the old barn's history rather than anything more pointed, and what she heard, in the careful, roundabout way small towns discuss matters best left undiscussed, only deepened her understanding of the shape of the fraud. Old-timers remembered Josiah Renfield as an honest, meticulous man whose sudden death had struck many as peculiar at the time, given how sure-footed and experienced a rider he had always been, though nobody had ever thought to connect his passing with anything beyond simple misfortune. More than one person mentioned, in passing, that Harlan Voss had come into a surprising amount of land and capital in the years following Renfield's death, though the explanation offered publicly had always been an inheritance from an uncle back east, a story that, Clara now noted, nobody could ever quite confirm with specifics. It was Henrietta Poe, the widow who ran the mercantile and had let Clara her small room, who first cautioned her to move carefully. Henrietta had noticed Clara's frequent trips out to the old barn, had seen her return one evening with a wooden case wrapped carefully in her shawl, and being a woman who had weathered her own share of the town's quiet cruelties, she asked Clara directly, over tea one evening, whether her digging had turned up something more than rotted timber. Clara, who trusted almost no one else in Millhaven by that point, found herself confiding in Henrietta, and Henrietta's face went pale as she listened. Harlan Voss holds a mortgage on half the businesses on this street, including mine, she said, gripping Clara's hand across the small table. If what you're saying is true, and he learns you know it, he will not treat you as a curious widow anymore, Clara. You will be a danger to him, and men like Voss do not let danger stand unaddressed. It was the first time in months anyone had spoken Clara's given name with such open warmth, and something in her steadied at the sound of it even as a warning itself settled cold and heavy in her stomach. Word travels through small towns away water finds its way downhill, quietly and inevitably, and within 2 weeks Harlan Voss himself came calling at the mercantile, dressed in his finest dark coat, his manner pitched to the same easy, avuncular warmth he was known for across the county. He had heard, he said, that Mrs. Whitfield had taken an interest in old Dunmore's collapsed barn, and he'd come by neighborly concern to see how she was faring, and perhaps to offer, should she find the property more burdened than it was worth, a generous price to relieve her of it. Clara, sitting very straight with her hands folded in the exact posture her mother had taught her for receiving difficult news, thanked him for his concern and told him, quite truthfully, that she had found the old barn far more interesting than she'd expected. A flicker of cold calculation crossed behind Voss's practiced smile at that, and he pressed her gently on what exactly she'd found so interesting. But Clara, who had learned patience from a lifetime of careful bookkeeping, only said that old buildings held all manner of forgotten things, and left the matter there. He did not press further, but he did not leave reassured either, and Clara understood, watching him walk back toward his waiting carriage, that she had just declared herself, however quietly, an adversary to the most powerful man in the township. In the weeks that followed, small troubles began accumulating around her with a regularity too consistent to be mere coincidence. Her modest credit at the mercantile was quietly questioned by a visiting bank auditor, though Henrietta refused outright to restrict it. A carpenter Clara had hired to help stabilize what remained of the barn's standing walls suddenly discovered he had no time to spare for the work, offering only an uneasy apology that would not meet her eyes. Bertram Cole, the lawyer she consulted about the original mortgage, informed her with evident discomfort that he could no longer take her case, citing a conflict of interest he declined to specify, though Clara understood well enough what conflict he meant. She spent several sleepless nights weighing her position, aware that she possessed evidence capable of unraveling a decade of quiet theft across the entire township, and equally aware that possessing such evidence meant little if Voss found a way to discredit or silence her before she could put it to proper use, as she now suspected. With growing unease, he might once have silenced Josiah Renfield himself. It was Henrietta who ultimately pointed her toward a solution, recalling that her late husband's brother had once worked as a clerk for the Territorial Land Office in Topeka, and suggesting that rather than trust the matter to county officials who might owe their positions to Voss's influence, Clara should take her evidence directly to the Federal Land Office, which retained jurisdiction over any dispute involving the original Homestead Act patents, and would have both the authority and the distance from local politics to investigate a survey fraud of this scale. Clara spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing her case with the same unhurried thoroughness her father had instilled in her, laying Renfield's original survey figures alongside the corrected boundaries currently on file at the county office, documenting the pattern with careful, methodical precision. And she traveled to Topeka herself, using nearly the last of her small remaining funds for the train fare, to deliver the evidence in person rather than risk it disappearing in transit. The federal investigators arrived in Millhaven that autumn, 3 careful men who spent the better part of a month reviewing survey records, land patents, and mortgage filings with a thoroughness that left the whole township holding its breath. And what they found, once they had cause to look closely, confirmed every line of Josiah Renfield's decade-old suspicion. The boundary corrections traced directly back to filings submitted under Harlan Voss's authority as the township's land agent, corrections that had shifted valuable creek bottom acreage away from a dozen homesteading families and into the hands of the Millhaven Trust or entities quietly controlled by Voss himself. And further investigation revealed that Voss had used the inflated collateral value of this fraudulently acquired land to justify a pattern of predatory mortgages against struggling farm families across the county, mortgages that, when families defaulted in hard seasons, allowed him to absorb still more land at a fraction of its worth. Voss was arrested that November on charges of land fraud and forgery that would, in the reckoning to come, cost him his position, his fortune, and the greater part of the empire he had spent over a decade quietly building. And in the course of the investigation, examiners determined that the very mortgage used to foreclose on Daniel Whitfield's farm had been calculated using deliberately understated land values, a discrepancy that, once corrected, entitled Clara to a substantial restitution from the bank's seized assets. Clara could have taken that restitution and left Millhaven entirely, and no one who knew her story would have thought less of her for it. Instead, she used the funds, together with a portion of the assets recovered from Voss's fraudulent holdings of the federal office allocated toward community restitution, to help establish a new, cooperatively governed land registry office for the township, staffed by an elected board rather than any single appointed agent, ensuring that no future survey correction could be filed without independent verification and public record. She personally oversaw the restoration of boundary lines for the dozen families whose land had been quietly stolen over the preceding decade, working alongside county surveyors with the same careful, patient attention her father had once brought to walking the Bishop property line. And when the work was finally done, the township, in a gesture that moved Clara to unexpected tears, voted to name the new registry office's founding record-keeper position after her, a role she accepted humbly and held for many years afterward. The old collapsed barn itself she had rebuilt, not as a working structure but as a modest township archive, its rescued timbers incorporated into the new construction, and the wall where Renfield's hidden documents had waited 11 years to be found became, in time, the site of a small brass plaque bearing his name and a simple inscription honoring the courage it takes to preserve a difficult truth until someone patient enough arrives to find it. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began. A woman of 29, cast out with almost nothing, who paid $2 for a collapsed barn nobody else wanted, because somewhere beneath her grief she still carried her father's conviction that land and paper never truly lie, even when the men who trade in them do, and her mother's quiet faith that the deepest value often hides inside what the world has already written off as ruin. Clara Whitfield did not set out to expose Harlan Voss, nor to restore a decade of stolen boundaries to the families of Millhaven Township. She set out only to survive with what dignity she could gather, to trust the careful habits her parent had given her, and to look a little closer at a broken thing before agreeing that it was worthless. What she found behind that false wall was not treasure in any ordinary sense, but something more enduring still, Proof that patience, paired with an honest reckoning of the facts, can restore not only what one person has lost, but what an entire community never even knew it was missing. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Clara's story tonight. If her quiet courage, her patience, and her refusal to accept that a ruined thing had nothing left offer moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share this video with someone who might need reminding that what looks like nothing sometimes holds everything. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something others had already written off? We read every story you share with us, and we're always glad to have you here. Until next time, stay close.